entitled Addressing the Legacy of Nuclear Weapons, sponsored by the missions of Austria, Kazakhstan, Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, its youth initiative Reverse the Trend, and the Marshallese Educational Initiative. My name is Brock Walker, and I'm honored to be your moderator today. I serve as the Nuclear Justice Campaign Manager for Reverse the Trend, the youth initiative of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. Reflecting on my own background, I'm reminded of the profound impact nuclear weapons have had on my community in Las Vegas, Nevada. Over 928 nuclear tests were conducted just 65 miles north of the Las Vegas Strip from 1951 to 1992, causing long-lasting health and environmental consequences. The radiation fallout affected not only my community, but those in neighboring areas, highlighting the far-reaching and devastating impact of nuclear weapons testing. This experience fuels my commitment to nuclear justice and underscores the urgency of our discussion today. This panel is indispensable in understanding the multifaceted legacy of nuclear weapons and the urgent need to address it within the context of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I'd like to provide a brief overview of the developments around the recognition of the legacy of nuclear weapons in the International Disarmament and Non-Proliferation Forum. At the 2010 NPT Review Conference, states parties expressed their deep concern at the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons, and reaffirmed the need for all states at all times to comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. By the 2015 NPT Review Conference, 159 governments had endorsed this stance. Furthermore, survivors and victims of nuclear tests delivered testimony at the conferences on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. The experiences and testimonies of survivors and victims of the tests contributed to a wider understanding of the harmful effects of the testing and use of nuclear weapons, especially the gendered and disproportionate impact of ionizing radiation on women and girls. On July 7, 2017, 122 states adopted the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons after a negotiating conference on the matter. The treaty contains robust humanitarian provisions and positive obligations on victims' assistance, environmental remediation, and international cooperation and assistance. These provisions were further reinforced in the Vienna Action Plan, adopted at the first meeting of states parties to the treaty on June 2, 2022. On October 13, 2022, the Human Rights Council adopted its resolution 51/35, entitled Technical Assistance in Capacity Building to Address the Human Rights Implications of the Nuclear Legacy in the Marshall Islands. In 2023, at the 78th session of the General Assembly, 179 states, an overwhelming majority, voted in favor of adopting Resolution 78/240, entitled Addressing the Legacy of Nuclear Weapons. This resolutes member states that have used or tested nuclear weapons or any other nuclear explosive devices to share technical and scientific information regarding the humanitarian and environmental consequences of such actions with affected member states. Additionally, the resolution calls upon member states in a position to do so to provide this assistance. At this NPT PrepCom, Kiribati, Kazakhstan, and the Marshall Islands submitted a working paper on the legacy of nuclear weapons. This is the first time that states incorporated the views of affected communities. The resolution further urged states parties to support nuclear justice. As we engage in this dialogue, let us remember the human stories behind the statistics and treaties. The continued advocacy of those affected by nuclear testing and youth activists inspire hope and drive our mission for a safer, healthier, and more just world. On this note, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Jean-Gary Zirimbet, Counselor of the Permanent Mission of Kazakhstan to the United Nations, has a law degree from the Kazakh State Law University and a master's degree in International Relations from King's College, London, War Studies Department. Mr. Zirimbet has been working in the Foreign Ministry since August 2003 and has over 15 years of experience in the International Legal Department, the Disarmament and Non-Proliferation Division, and the Permanent Mission to the International Organizations in Vienna. His previous position was the head of Disarmament and Non-Proliferation Division of the MFA. Jean-Gary has been involved in the process of the implementation of Articles 6 and 7 of the TPNW. Please, take it away.
Thank you very much, Brock, for the moderatorship. Excellencies, dear colleagues, first of all, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. And, coming in and joining us for the discussion, which, as Brock has already mentioned, been a addressed in our working paper submitted to this PrepCom and in our joint statement delivered by the permanent representative of Kiribati. I will not go into the details. I'd like just to recall that states parties acknowledged in the 2010 review conference's action plan the necessity to address nuclear legacy and provide environmental remediation and victim assistance for those states parties affected by nuclear weapons testing in the past. And two of our countries, specifically Kazakhstan and Kiribati, have been working closely as co-chairs of the working group under the Article 6 and 7 of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We also tabled the first committee resolution from the General Assembly last session, which enjoyed the overwhelming support, and we are grateful to those countries supported, and we also understand the positions of those countries who couldn't support this resolution. So this issue, of course, is pertinent for our government and the affected community, which still suffer from the past nuclear testing. And we believe that all of this work is still relevant, although the nuclear testing was held more than 30 years ago. Still, there are second, third generation victims who need support by the international community and also the environment. There is nothing late. We just appeal to the international community to attract more attention to this issue, as we see it as one of the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. With this, I'd like to stop, and we'll be happy to be engaged in the Q&A session. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Councillor, for your remarks. I think it's really important to highlight the continuing need to provide victims assistance in humanitarian. Our next speaker is Benedict Kabua Madison, the Executive Director of the Marshallese Educational Initiative, a nonprofit based in Springdale, Arkansas, where the highest concentration of Marshallese reside outside of the home islands. Born on Majuro Atoll, Madison migrated to the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas with his family at the age of 6. His work at MEI includes leading efforts to raise awareness of the biological, ecological, and cultural consequences of the nuclear testing legacy on Marshallese homelands, as well as the impact of climate change. Benedict has spoken at conferences and events in the US and internationally, including the United Nations General Assembly. Benedict also serves as an advisor for Reverse the Trend. Benedict worked previously at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences as a community health advocate and remains active in addressing health disparities. He is also committed to raising Marshallese educational attainment levels. Benedict is pursuing a degree in political science at Arkansas State University. Please, go ahead.
Thank you, Brock. Good afternoon, Excellencies, colleagues. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for today's gathering. On a Sunday afternoon after church services on Bikini Atoll, U.S. Navy Commodore Ben Wyatt asked Marshallese elder Judah if the Bikini people would temporarily give up their lands for world peace and for the good of all mankind. With Judah's non-committal words, everything is in God's hands. U.S. cameras that filmed the exchange cut, and the Bikini people were removed from their homelands forever. Realistically, the Bikinians had no choice. U.S. President Harry Truman had already approved Bikini Atoll as the site of U.S. nuclear tests months before the stage events on Bikini Atoll. The Bikini people were starving and forgotten within weeks of their removal to a nearby island. The U.S. military detonated its first test on July 1st of 1946. And while it was equivalent in size to the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Castle Bravo detonation on March 1st of 1954 was 1,000 times larger. At 15 megatons, Bravo vaporized 3 islands. The blast lifted crushed coral, plant, and marine life into the atmosphere and rained down as fallout on unsuspecting islanders. Never having seen fallout, they later described it as snow or salt. The people of Romola who were exposed to a near-lethal doses of radiation bore the brunt. They and other Marshalleys soon became unwitting test subjects of a secret study, Project 4.1, to measure the effects of radiation exposure on human beings. Atomic Energy Commission doctors and U.S. military officials downplayed the impact radiation exposure had on babies born with deformities and children and women who were diagnosed with leukemia and thyroid cancer. Their lands were dangerously uninhabitable, and the U.S. military refused to relocate the Romoladis, who were eventually removed by Greenpeace on the Rainbow Warrior decades later. After our Marshallese people voted to create our own independent government, and a compact of free association was signed with the United States, many Marshallese people whose ancestral lands had been contaminated migrated to the United States, seeking access to healthcare, education, and jobs. Today, many Marshallese people live in the diaspora. The highest concentration resides in the landlocked state of Arkansas, where I live with my family. In Arkansas and across the United States, many Marshallese people my age and younger who were taken to the U.S. by their families or are increasingly born in the United States have never learned the people's history or the history of nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands. It is not taught in U.S. schools. Marshallese parents and elders in the U.S. often do not share this history with the youth. For many, it is too painful to recount. Others do not feel it is their history. Throughout the testing period and after, the United States minimized the damage done to the Marshallese lands and bodies and normalized radiation as naturally occurring. The U.S. also promulgated a narrative of only 4 atolls being affected. This served to reduce its future liability and responsibility. In public, at least, this narrative remains consistent. 70 years ago, in the wake of the Bravo detonation, Marshallese leaders made a plea to the United Nations to end all nuclear weapons testing. They stressed the importance of land to the Marshallese people and how the last World War and U.S. occupation had already taken much of it, and more was being lost to radiation. Despite what they saw, the leaders held faith in U.S. words that testing was necessary for the good of humanity. The leaders wrote that if this were still the case and more suitable testing locations could not be found, they provided suggestions. First, they wrote, all precautionary measures be taken to safeguard people and their possession. Second, their people be instructed in safety measures. The people of Romola would have avoided much danger if they had known not to drink the waters tainted with radioactive dust. Third, they called for adequate compensation for the loss of lands and possessions so that what had happened to the Bikinians and Inuitabis was not repeated. Finally, that Marshallese medical practitioners and aides should be taught how to detect and circumvent preventable dangers. The UN Trusteeship Council deferred to the U.S. Rather than investigating, it was satisfied by U.S. assurances that minimal harm had resulted from the test and trusted the U.S. to take precautionary measures as it stated it would do. We all know this did not occur. In the aftermath of Bravo, the U.S. ramped up testing, conducting 55 of the 67 total tests after Bravo. When the inhabitants were returned to contaminated lands, there were immediate and long-term health effects. Today, we know that the legacy of nuclear testing has brought ongoing biological, ecological, and cultural consequences. In the diaspora, at no time was this vulnerability and the stark inequities in which our people live were more evident during the pandemic, when Marshallese people in Arkansas made up nearly half of the deaths in the region, yet only made up 3% of the population. The nuclear testing legacy has sickened our people, not only with various cancers and genetic abnormalities, but also diabetes, due in part to a diet rapidly changing from healthy foods to imported processed foods. The testing poisoned our lands and displaced our people from them. As Marshallese leaders referenced 70 years ago, our lands are our identity. Take away their lands and their spirits go also, they wrote. U.S. occupiers not only took our lands, but they renamed them, changing centuries-old place names rooted in matrilineal culture to names easier for U.S. soldiers to pronounce, or after 1950 actresses over-referred to at the time as bombshells. Today, after 80 years of colonial erasure, the United States still refuses to take full responsibility. What now? While the Marshallese government is right to continue pressuring the United States to recognize its responsibility and meets its obligation to the Marshallese people, it is also time to look to alternative path to nuclear justice. What Marshallese leaders called for in 1954 generally stands true today. The leaders wanted transparency or knowledge of what was happening and its effects. They wanted the agency to be able to care for their people medically, and they wanted just compensation for the loss of land and possessions. The importance of land was stressed throughout the document due to its cultural significance and economic value. Article 6 of the TPNW calls for victim-assisted environmental remediation. The article specifies medical care, rehabilitation, and psychological support for social and economic inclusion and environmental remediation. We should also ask, as did the leaders 70 years ago, for full transparency. Thank you.
Thank you, Benetic, for your personal and impactful testimony. I appreciate you highlighting the
Thank you very much, Bob. Good afternoon, everyone. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Benedict has shared our story of the nuclear legacy, and I will try to hone in on our efforts and how we're trying to be part of the efforts to keep nuclear a nuclear-free zone, this world free from nuclear. So I'd like to first of all thank Kazakhstan and Kiribati and all the organizers for inviting Marshall Islands to be co-sponsor for this event. I'd also like to acknowledge my fellow panelists. And I'm familiar with many of you here, but I also see some new friends and new faces as well. And I'd like to personally welcome all of you here this afternoon. The Marshall Islands is a party to the NPT. However, we are not yet party to the TPNW. For years, when asked why we have not ratified the TPNW, our answer has largely been along the lines of a need for greater clarity on Article 6 of the TPNW. The question boils down to whether Article 6 of the TPNW absolves the states that conducted the nuclear weapon tests in other territories from the responsibility to make right the wrongs that they have done. The question centers on whether Article 6, particularly sub-articles 1 and 2, absolves these states of their responsibility to provide environmental remediation and victim redress. I'm fully aware of our responsibility to our own people for environmental remediation and victims assistance. Over the years, the Marshall Islands government has striven to fulfill these responsibilities and to protect and empower the Marshallese people. We have done as much as we can within our means and capabilities. However, the Marshall Islands does not have the technical expertise, nor the technology or the resources to fully provide for victims' redress and environmental remediation arising as a direct result of the nuclear legacy. So it is from the understanding of our own limitation and constraints, as well as the injustice of being in a position where we are unable to remedy a situation that is not of our own making, that we seek assurance and confirmation that interpretation of Article 6 of the TPNW in its entirety is fair in its meaning and application to states with nuclear legacies that they did not cause. In this regard, it is important that Article 6 is interpreted in its entirety to recognize that the states that use and test these weapons must be held accountable for environmental remediation and victims redress. Justice, morality, and humanity demands that these states take accountability for the environmental damage and human suffering that they have caused. Despite 66 years passing since the end of the 12 years of nuclear weapons tests in the Marshall Islands, those responsible have not yet done right by the Marshallese people. The poison to our environment remains. Our people's suffering has not been acknowledged, their needs left unaddressed, and they are unable to return to their tall homes. Only by returning to their homeland will they be able to live with dignity and enjoy their right to self-determination, reconnected with their roots. The Marshall Islands government strongly believes that this world would be a better place without nuclear weapons. We strongly believe that the TPNW and regional treaties like the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty are complementary to the NPT. Our ongoing assessment on the TPNW is born out of the concerns earlier mentioned, and this is where we will need assistance in fully coming to terms with the entirety of Article 6. By this I mean that we need to carefully consider and would welcome insights and discussions on the Article 6, Para 3, quote unquote, without prejudice, provision on the responsibility of other states under international law. In our view, if more states and NGOs speak to the applicability of Article 6.3 and affirm that this provision provides that the states responsible under international law are not absolved, then this would ease uncertainties of Article 6.1 and 2. We need more states and NGOs to speak to Article 6.3 and the legal implications of this quote unquote without prejudice provision. From my own discussions, I am informed that this Article 6.3 without prejudice provision means that despite acknowledging our own obligations, it does not absolve the responsibilities of other states under international law. In essence, Article 6.3 gives to provide environmental remediation and victims redress. Article 6.3 gives priority to the claims against other states who owe a responsibility under international law to provide environmental remediation and victims redress. If this is the case, then why are we not speaking about Article 6? Why aren't we speaking about Article 6 more? We should be having serious discussions on the legal implications of Article 6.3 and the responsibilities of other states under international law, particularly those responsible for the use and testing of nuclear weapons. We need to talk about Article 6.3 and its implications, as well as how we can work together to hold accountable those states that are responsible for nuclear legacies. It is my hope that we will reach a full understanding of the extent of the responsibilities acknowledged under Article 6.1 and 6.2, balanced against our Article 6.3, which gives priority to the responsibility of those states that are responsible for these legacies. We will continue to engage in these constructive discussions in Article 6 with all those willing to offer their insights and expertise entities, including states, civil society, and NGO. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. In terms of next steps and how we can make greater progress on addressing these legacies, the legacies of nuclear weapons, the Marshall Islands is working with OHCHR, among many others, to fully comprehend the human rights implications of our nuclear legacy and how best we can address them. This will also inform our deliberations on the ratification of treaties on nuclear weapons. In terms of the TPNW specifically, we look forward to more discussions and insistence on Article 6.3, recognizing the responsibility of states that conducted these tests. If given a greater prominence, these discussions will lay to rest the concerns over Article 6.1 and 6.2, allowing more states, including the Marshall Islands, to positively consider ratification in the near future. The Marshall Islands government will continue to fulfill its responsibilities to its people, and part of that responsibility requires that we pursue nuclear justice from those responsible for our nuclear legacy. That responsibility further compels us to ensure that nuclear weapons never again enter the Marshall Islands. In that respect, we will remain committed to our shared vision for a nuclear-free world. Thank you. Kumaldaba.
Thank you, Ambassador DeBrum, especially for explaining the Republic of Marshall Islands' perspective on these treaties which directly concern its future. Our next speaker is Rafael Pandulangan, Human Rights Officer, Environment and Climate Change, Unit Development, Economic and Social Rights Branch, Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. He is supporting the implementation of HRC Resolution 51/35, addressing the human rights impact of the nuclear legacy in the Marshall Islands. The report will be presented at HRC 57. Prior to this mandate, Rafael worked on transitional justice efforts for victims of the war on drugs and gender-based violence in the Philippines. He obtained his Juris Doctor from the University of the Philippines, an LLM from Cambridge, and a Master's in Human Rights at Oxford. Please, go ahead.
Rob, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and my many thanks to the organizers of this panel for the opportunity to speak on OHCHR's work on addressing the nuclear legacy. It's an honor to share this panel with such esteemed guests. Now, I'm conscious that Ambassador DeBrum and Benedict has already spoken intimately on the nuclear legacy in the Marshall Islands, so allow me to take a step back and zero in on the mandate that I support and on our approach in implementing HRC 51/35 and what this could mean for nuclear disarmament at large. Now, after a week and a half here at the NPT session, it is safe to say that there's much room and likewise much potential for the utilization of the human rights framework in disarmament discourse. My colleagues and I have covered several events over the past days, and we would hear terms like transparency in reporting, risk mitigation, and irreversibility. And what was most striking to me as a human rights officer is that these terms already sounded like human rights law at work, yet rarely was the framework invoked. When we speak of transparency in reporting, what comes to mind is the right to free expression, for example, which includes not only the right to speak, but the right to seek information, to receive information, and to impart it. When we speak of risk mitigation and irreversibility, this sounds to me like institutional reform to guarantee the non-repetition. Clearly, the human rights language is there, yet unfortunately, rarely do we see the framework cited. Which leads me to my first point. Nuclear disarmament and human rights share common ground. A normative framework under no less than the UN Charter, yes, among many other instruments, which indicate not only a shared vocabulary, but a shared aspiration. Indeed, the link is made explicit in the Declaration on the Right to Development. Article 7 calls, and I quote, all states to promote the establishment, maintenance, and strengthening of international peace and security, and to that end should do their utmost to achieve general and complete disarmament. In these discussions, we have heard from the perspectives of international humanitarian law, and perhaps this is something that's more commonly, maybe more familiar to the ear. But addressing humanitarian consequences need not be limited to the jus in bello, need not be limited to IHL. The threats of nuclear weapons persist even outside the theater of war, and indeed history shows in the Marshall Islands that Operation Crossroads, earlier referenced by Benedict, was conducted in July 1946 and was the world's first peacetime nuclear detonation. So nuclear is not only an IHL issue, it is simultaneously an international human rights law issue as well. And it is that link between human rights and nuclear legacies that lies at the center of my work with OHCHR, which leads us nicely to the second part of this presentation. As mentioned, I'm supporting the implementation of HRC 5135 on addressing the human rights implications of the nuclear legacy in the Marshall Islands. The resolution asks us to do three things, requests my office to do three things: to provide technical assistance and capacity building to the National Nuclear Commission of the Republic of the Marshall Islands to build local capacities, as earlier referenced by Ambassador de Brum. And this facet of our mandate is being led by my colleague Diego, who is based in the UN Pacific Office. The second request is to prepare a report on addressing the challenges and barriers to the full realization and enjoyment of human rights stemming from the nuclear legacy, of which I am the primary drafter. And third, to seek the views of stakeholders and conduct an enhanced interactive dialogue as part of HRC 57 this September through October. Now notice, these requests are not separate and distinct. On the contrary, we have deliberately executed this mandate so that one task feeds into the other. So for example, we've conducted several missions to the Marshall Islands, to both Majuro and Eniwetok in December 2023, as well as February to March 2024 and in May, for stakeholder engagement and to continue capacity building workshops. These engagements, in turn, inform the report that is underway and which will be presented at the EID in the coming session. Now, I've been asked to speak more closely on the report, and one particularly unique aspect of this work I'd like to emphasize is the transitional justice framework which we've adopted, which leads us to a very important question. What do we mean by transitional justice? Now, the TJ framework is, transitional justice is a framework of justice to address human rights violations left unredressed. Now, if we were to take a step back and we were to perhaps browse through our minds, one may notice that when we speak of justice, the quintessential image comes in the shape of a prosecutorial project, that is criminal accountability. What transitional justice emphasizes is how justice comes in many a form. Specifically, sure, through accountability, that is one factor, but yes, also others. Likewise, through the pillars of truth, through the pillar of reparations, through guarantees of non-repetition, which includes memorialization. Through these separate pillars, transitional justice sends a message loud and clear that there is justice through truth, that there is justice through memory, that there is justice in ensuring that violations of human rights are never forgotten and never again repeated. And perhaps already here, we can begin to visualize the links between the language, the links between the NPT on one hand and human rights law on the other, between never again and between abolition. The report builds upon this framework in addressing the nuclear legacy and begins by focusing on the pillar of truth. And we did this for, well, principled as well as, practical reasons. This is an 8,500 word report covering a nuclear legacy of 78 years and counting. So we recognize the need to exercise authorial discretion and to use this as an opportunity to lay groundwork for future continuing advocacy work. In so doing, this report seeks to do two things. It engages with the truth pillar by engaging in first truth-telling and secondly truth-seeking. The report engages in a form of truth-telling by outlining key moments, impacts, points of contention, and efforts for justice in the nuclear legacy. It discusses challenges and barriers the nuclear legacy poses to the full realization and enjoyment of human rights, and examines the role of truth-seeking in addressing them. We take a comprehensive approach to human rights impacts, taking into consideration both direct and downstream impacts of radiological exposure. That is, not only the immediate impact of nuclear tests and the resulting worldwide fallout, but the continuing irradiation of the Marshallese environment. It also takes into consideration both radiological and non-radiological consequences of exposure. So take, for example, health impacts. We've looked closely at impacts on the right to health, which includes both the physical and the mental, and the psychosocial impacts as well, associated not only with the events known to have occurred, but with the uncertainties associated with nuclear legacies. So in closing, there are three key takeaways I hope to impart, and I hope to have imparted through this presentation. First, that human rights can serve as a useful framework for disarmament discourse, as well as for other conversations related to nuclear, related to the TPNW, for example, when it comes to victim assistance and environmental remediation. Secondly, that there is a need to take an integrated approach, interpreting different sources of law, may they be qualified, characterized as IHRL or IHL or others, and to interpret them in such a way that they are aligned with the other. And we should take note that when we speak of systematic integration, this is not only founded in practical suggestion, this is in fact rooted in international legal order. From ICJ decisions to Article 31 of the Vienna Convention of the Law of Treaties, there is a recognition that requires treaties to be interpreted in light of other agreements as well. And thirdly, lastly, that the transitional justice framework is particularly insightful for these purposes, as it provides a framework for remediation through truth, accountability, reparations, and guarantees of non-repetition, including memorialization. In so doing, transparency in reporting, risk mitigation, irreversibility, many of the topics that we've covered over these past days are not only aspects of NPT, but arguments reinforced by human rights law and advanced not only through the means of interpretation, but likewise in the nature of human rights obligation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenn Kalenga, for providing an overview of your and your office's work on exposing the breadth and depth of the nuclear legacy. Our next speaker is Ambassador Alexander Kmet, the Director of the Disarmament, Arms Control, and Non-Proliferation Department of the Austrian Foreign Ministry and President of the June 2022 First Meeting of States Parties to the TPNW. From 2016 to 2019, Alexander Kmet served as Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the Political and Security Committee of the European Union. He is one of the architects of the initiative on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons and the TPNW. During a sabbatical in 2019 to 2020, as Senior Research Fellow at King's College London, he wrote the book, The Treaty Prohibiting Nuclear Weapons, How It Was Achieved and Why It Matters. He was elected Arms Control Person of the Year 2014 by the US-based Arms Control Association. Alexander Kmet holds an Austrian law degree and an MPhil in International Relations from Cambridge University. Please, take it away.
Thanks a lot. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. It's really great turnout. We're very pleased about that, and we're also pleased to co-sponsor this event together with our partners. I was asked to speak briefly about the NPT, the TPNW, and the Vienna Action Plan when it comes to the crucial issue of nuclear legacies, which is of course one of the great injustices of the nuclear age. As was talked about before, nuclear tests often took place in remote parts of the world with severe humanitarian, societal, and intergenerational impact, often on marginalized communities with little or no information and little or no compensation. So next to the use of nuclear weapons in Japan in 1945, this humanitarian legacy of nuclear testing gives us the best and most clear understanding of the human cost and of the humanitarian, societal, and environmental impact of nuclear weapons. So the humanitarian legacy is mentioned in a way indirectly in the NPT in its preamble, with the need to make every effort to prevent the devastation that would be visited upon humankind from a nuclear war. So this is of course no direct reference, but the absolute imperative to prevent these consequences underpins the goals of the NPT, both with regard to nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. So it really took until 2010 that the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapon and the humanitarian nuclear legacy was brought to the fore in a more sustained way in the NPT context. And of course it was already mentioned, the 2010 action plan expressing deep concern about its consequences. Following the NPT 2010 and the humanitarian initiative, as it is referred to, comprised of international conferences and a set of cross-regional statements expressing this concern and looking at the scientific evidence around humanitarian consequences and also the risks of nuclear weapons. As was mentioned, 2015 iteration of the humanitarian statement was supported by 159 countries, which is unprecedented in the UN history. The result of this was, of course, the TPNW in 2017, which was very strongly informed and in a way was instrumentally made possible by the testimonies of affected, of representatives from affected communities. In the TPW itself, the Article 6 and 7 makes addressing the humanitarian legacy a central feature of the treaty and really the embodiment and expression of the humanitarian underpinning that this treaty has been informed. I was very honored in 2022 to chair the first meeting of states parties, which then built on the text of the treaty, both in the political declaration that was adopted and the Vienna Action Plan, which formulated a whole range of issues how states parties of the TPW intend to take this work forward. And of course, as you know, this work is led by Kiribati and Kazakhstan, who have been co-chairing this working group now for a while. Let me just mention, just run through really the key aspects of the action plan as far as they pertain to the humanitarian legacy, victim assistance and environmental remediation. So I'm quoting from the action plan: the treaty's positive obligations are central to the humanitarian goals of the treaty, and they aim to address the harm from past use and testing of nuclear weapons, as well as the ongoing and expected future harm from the resulting contamination. So the actions that have been agreed upon in Vienna really are engaging, sustained engagement with the relevant stakeholders, sustained engagement with information exchange, development of nomination of national focal points on this issue, to develop mechanisms of how to provide assistance. Of course, all of this being done in a multi-stakeholder approach, cooperating on victim assistance and environmental remediation, and also voluntary reporting to look at the feasibility of a trust fund to address these issues. And then for affected states parties, really working to develop more information on the effects and on the needs assessments, and of course for states in a position to do so, to mobilize resources to address this. So the TPNW is the first international treaty that creates this legal obligation, a positive obligation to deal with the humanitarian legacy and to provide a framework of how to redress it. And of course, this is a long-term engagement, and it's a very cooperative way of dealing with these issues. So I think it's really a fundamental sea change for the first time in a legal normative framework to deal with this issue. Now, with the NPT, I mentioned that it's indirectly contained in the preamble, and it came up in 2010 in the action plan, which of course is the last time the NPT was able to have an agreed outcome document. But we have seen in the last 15 years a very significant shift in the discourse. If you compare NPT meetings 2010, there was very little talk about the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, and now I think we see specifically from developing countries a lot of really well-informed statements on the humanitarian impact, what the use of nuclear weapons would likely mean for them. And I think all of this really has been fundamentally informed by first of all, the scientific evidence, but by the human experiences that were shared from countries that had experienced that in their own history. And I think what we saw in the outcome document of the 2022 review conference, which of course then was not adopted, there was not all that much that from my perspective was positive, but one of the few positive aspects was that actually there seemed to be a degree of agreement to move the needle forward somewhat on acknowledging the humanitarian legacy in the NPT context, which of course then came to nothing when the NPT outcome document was not adopted and the REFCON 22 failed. But I think the job for this review cycle really is to build on that what could not be achieved last time, but to bring this aspect very strongly also into the discussion of the NPT as a key driver that underpins our work on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. So in that respect, we really are supportive of the working paper, of the statement, and of course also the resolution that was landmark resolution introduced by Kazakhstan and Kiribati at the last UNGA, which we were of course happy to support. So this is an ongoing process to bring these issues more into our work also in the NPT. They're of course fundamentally woven into the work of the TPNW, but we also need to do more to bring it into the NPT, and I hope that it's definitely not an issue that's going away. So I think quite the opposite. We see an increasing focus on that, and I think this is really important to keep the NPT relevant and also as a underlying motivation and driver for progress in the implementation, both on disarmament and non-proliferation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for highlighting the history of the recognition of the humanitarian legacy within the context of the NPT and its complementarity with the TPNW. I think it's very important to recognize the growing consensus and diminishing opposition behind recognizing this impact. Our final speaker before our discussion is Christian N. Chibata, who is the Policy and Advocacy Coordinator of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and the Project Coordinator for Reverse the Trend, Save Our People, Save Our Planet. He has been a nuclear disarmament activist since 2010. Previously, he served as the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation's Geneva and New York representative and advisor for the permanent mission of the Marshall Islands. Christian is also serving as an advisor on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons for the permanent mission of Kiribati, where he works extensively with the co-chairs of the Intersessional Informal Working Group on Articles 6 and 7 of the TPNW. Jumano holds a MA in Non-Proliferation and Terrorism Studies from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies and an MA in Political Science from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Brock. Before I begin, I would like to thank the co-sponsors, the Marshall Islands, Austria, Kiribati, Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, Reverse the Trend, and the Marshallese Education Initiative. I think this is a very timely discussion. I would like to first discuss Articles 6 and 7 of the TPNW. I think it's very important, and this has been discussed by analysts as well as something that Kiribati strongly believes in, that Articles 6 and 7 create a framework of shared responsibility in which all state parties of the TPNW have committed to help state parties with affected communities to take steps to deal with the humanitarian and environmental impacts of nuclear weapons. So both articles should be read together as a framework that builds upon one another. The idea of the Article 7 really, is focused on the state parties providing resources and helping those states that have been affected by nuclear weapons with financial, technical, and other support. And it's significant also because it does not, there's a reference in Article 7(6), which states that without prejudice to any other duty or obligation, that it may have under international law a state party that has used or tested nuclear weapons or any other nuclear explosive devices shall have responsibility to provide adequate assistance to affected state parties for the purpose of victim assistance and environmental remediation. So in itself, with this section on Article 7, it does not absolve the user states of their responsibility. And this is something that that was mentioned previously by Ambassador Dubrim as a question regarding the TPNW. It should be noted that in 2018, Pacific state parties gathered in New Zealand at the Auckland Conference, in which they had a significant discussion on Article 7, in where they recognized the region's strong interests in the provisions for victim assistance and environmental remediation, and to help one another. And they also recognize that the Pacific region has a role to play in adding its voice to the global effort to strengthen the norm against these inhumane weapons. And quote, in the declaration, they mentioned that in the Pacific we are small, but we can have a big impact. And that's something that Kiribati has really taken to heart and really been moving forward in its implementation of both the legacy of nuclear weapons and its work here at the NPT PrepCom. So regarding the resolution on the legacy of nuclear weapons, which passed last year overwhelmingly, there's a section in the operative paragraph 1, which deals, which calls for further discussions on victim assistance, so to assist victims and to assess and remediate environments contaminated by the use and testing of nuclear weapons and other nuclear explosive devices, including through bilateral, regional, and multilateral frameworks, such as relevant treaties. So taking this in mind, Kiribati has been working very hard with its partners in terms of raising attention regarding nuclear justice within both the NPT framework and the TPNW as well. This is why Ambassador Sito last week delivered a joint statement on behalf of both affected state parties and several supportive states as well to try to raise the issue at this NPT PrepCom. As we move forward in partnership with Kazakhstan, we are looking at the review conference, in particular main committee 1, to begin discussions on nuclear justice. If you look at the working paper that was submitted by the Marshall Islands, Kiribati, and Kazakhstan, there's a series of both short-term recommendations